Okay, and hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those joining us in various time zones. My name is Raymond Karam, and I'm the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. And I'm delighted to welcome our global audience to this webinar today. As we continue to investigate and analyze the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on Gulf economies and societies, we're taking a closer look today at the startup ecosystem in the Gulf as the region weathers interrelated economic crises. Moderating the session today is AGSIW resident scholar Robert Mogielnicki. Robert is an expert in the political economy of the Middle East and North Africa and received his PhD from the University of Oxford's Magdalen College, where his dissertation examined the political economy of free zones in Gulf Arab countries. You can find his latest work on our website, agsiw.org, including his latest paper on the Gulf countries' early responses to the crises of 2020. Robert is joined by a stellar group of speakers from across the region, and he will introduce them in more detail shortly. But before we start, I'd like to remind you all that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website tomorrow. Also a reminder to our audience, you are in listen-only mode, but you'll be able to ask your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, or you can email us at info@agsiw.org or tag us on Twitter at GulfStatesInst. With that, Robert, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Raymond, and welcome to everyone watching live, as well as those who might watch later on. Back in 2019, and with the help of my colleagues here at AGSIW, I created a long-term research series called Next Gen Gulf. And the goal here was to better understand how advanced technologies are shaping Gulf Arab governments and economies. And today's event on Gulf startups fits well within this analytical framework. But I think the topic also sheds light on an important area of the Gulf's political economy that, in my opinion, has not received the due attention or the due credit and the attention that it deserves. With so much going on in the Gulf in terms of political and economic developments, it is a worthwhile question to ask why we should be thinking about the Gulf's startup ecosystem. But I'm going to put forward 3 reasons why, and I think my speakers here, or the speakers that joined us today, will give us many more to think about as the conversation develops. First, Gulf startups and the startup ecosystem, as well as entrepreneurship promotion, serves as an important feature of governmental efforts to create tech-driven knowledge economies. Now, we know that this is a slow process and success is not guaranteed, but I think that makes it more important than ever to compare different strategies and different initiatives for their effectiveness. And during past economic shocks and crises, we also saw local governments or regional governments double down on entrepreneurship promotion. And this is something that I expect that we'll see in the coming months and years ahead. Number 2, global investors and multinational firms are starting to take the Gulf startup ecosystem seriously, whether through high-profile acquisitions or other forms of business partnerships. And we can also point to the emergence of definitive startup hubs within the region, with innovative clusters forming around fintech, for example. And third, I want to bring it down to the micro level, because we can see Gulf citizens and expatriate residents really creating and driving some very exciting initiatives across the region, from cryptocurrency exchanges to e-commerce firms to payment platforms. And I would suggest that these initiatives have the potential to transform governmental services, economic processes, and even social relations in the region. So one regret is that we didn't bring more founders and entrepreneurs on to this call today, but Philip did remind me before we started that he himself is a founder. So we do have, I hope, some in the audience and also Philip on board to walk us through some of the challenges that founders are facing. Beyond that, we do have an excellent panel of speakers, and I'm going to briefly introduce them right now before we jump into the discussion. So starting with Dr. Mazin Alzaidi, he's the Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Ministry of Investment in Saudi Arabia. He's worked in this space for a number of years. Previously, he worked as a consultant at EY Advisory Services in Riyadh. He was an entrepreneur in London and has worked across the globe in this space. He also has an extensive academic portfolio and career with a bachelor's degree in computer engineering, 2 master's degrees, and a PhD in cybersecurity, Among other things, he is a lecturer in corporate innovation at the University of Warwick. You can find more information about Dr. Mazin and the other speakers on our website. I had to abbreviate some of this just for time constraints. Moving to Philip Bahoshy. Philip is the founder and CEO of Magnet. It's the first venture data platform serving founders and investors across emerging venture markets. He was raised in the UK with Iraqi origins and obtained an MBA from INSEAD, as well as a BSc from the London School of Economics. He's worked at Oliver Wyman as well as Barclays Wealth, working as the chief of staff for the CEO, and he's lived in the UAE working on entrepreneurship ecosystems for the last 12 years. Last but not least, Sonia Gokhale is a founding partner at Venture Soup, which is a Dubai-based investment platform that enables individuals to invest in high-growth technology companies around the world. You can see the more than 90 startups in their portfolio on their website. And previously, Sonia worked as a consultant at the Global Special Situations Group at the Abu Dhabi Investment Council, and previously also at Mercer Human Resource Consulting in Dubai and Toronto. She has a BSc from the University of Toronto in actuarial science and statistics and is a fellow at the Society of Actuaries. So with that, I'm going to jump right into the conversation, and I want to move to Philip first and ask Philip, you're working with Magnet, and the work that you do at Magnet is really an excellent resource for me when I want to understand what's going on with the startup ecosystem in the Gulf and the wider MENA region. I do turn to Magnet in your research and your report. So I thought you would be in an excellent position to give us a rundown of what you think are the key trends driving the Gulf startup ecosystem, and how likely are these trends to change given the extraordinary developments that happened in early 2020? And if they will change, what direction do you see them heading in?
Quite a lot to try and compact, but I'll try and keep it relatively brief. I think that since starting Magnet, which is focused on data 5 years ago, you've seen a real acceleration of investment in venture capital across the whole of the region. While there were first movers in this space dating back to the early 2000s, especially geographically in Jordan and Lebanon, really it was the UAE that embraced this concept of entrepreneurship back in 2010, 2011. Where you began to see the founders of companies like Souk and Karim, many of whom were ex-consultants and ex-bankers that decided to come and try and solve the majority of cases, infrastructure pain points that exist across the whole of the region using technology. And as governments across the whole of the region, I'm sure Dr. Mazin can speak to it from Saudi Arabia's perspective in more details, look to try and diversify economies away from oil reliance and into technology and new industries. Governments have been focusing on entrepreneurship as a mechanism to try and further develop the economy and solve for employment and opportunities for youth as well as more established talent across the whole of the region. Before this year, you began to see this acceleration. Last year saw close to $800 million worth of venture capital across 600 deals, which was a record for the number of investments that have taken place across the MENA region, MENA spanning all of North Africa, Levant, and the GCC, which is what we cover for our research reports. And most interestingly was that you began to see more international interest in the Middle East. With the acquisition of Karim by Uber, Amazon's acquisition of Souk, you really began to see international investors, international talent, as well as international governments begin to really understand that the Middle East, while fragmented by geography across 17, 16 countries, is a market that can be quite interesting, and especially investors that see the opportunity of valuations being cheaper in the region than elsewhere. Just to bring it to the current day, I think the truth of the matter is we brought out our H1 report only in July, and the numbers didn't quite tell the true story. You saw the same amount of investment as had been made as the year before, but a big drop in the number of deals, which reflected effectively two things. One, as investors became somewhat more cautious, they continued to make larger bets in more established, developed companies that they believed would likely pivot and develop into the crisis, coming out stronger, reducing their risk appetite in earlier stage investments. But the truth of the matter is that we already know, and Sonia can speak to this, a term sheet that would have been signed in January, February, March, or even April is likely to have been 6 to 9 months in the pipeline. And really the true impact of COVID-19, which we're probably going to see even in our Q3 report, which we're working on, will show that the activity has considerably dropped versus what happened earlier this year, with shifts being predominantly in the industries that did see increased demand and activity, such as e-commerce, logistics, healthcare, education. But the true impact of this year on the region is likely to come out, if not in Q3 end of year, but probably into the first quarter of 2021.
Great, thank you, Philip. I'm gonna take the conversation over to Dr. Mazin right now and ask, I would like to bring in the governmental perspective. And the first question is, how do innovation and entrepreneurship factor into the broader mission of the Ministry of Investment of Saudi Arabia? And beyond that, what policies and support mechanisms are in place to support startups and entrepreneurs as we move through this year, moving through Q3 and to Q4, and then into next year, when we might see some of the results of the coronavirus that Philip was talking about?
Sure, Robert. So in 2016, the Vision 2030 was announced. It's the roadmap for the country to diversify the economy. Of course, within that vision, entrepreneurs are the fuel of innovation and creating these amazing startups that bring value to the economy and create jobs. So the government has been giving a lot of attention to startups in the last couple of years. And this is across different aspects, whether regulation, ease of doing business, identifying opportunities, giving access to market. So startups have been, in the last couple of years, have gotten a lot of attention. And just to give you some of the examples and the huge change that's been happening, before 2018, if you were an entrepreneur and you wanted to set up in Saudi from the region or internationally, you weren't able to do that. That's when we've issued, or we come up with a new license for entrepreneurs that give them 100% ownership. They can obtain the license in less than 3 hours online. And that's when we started attracting regional and international startups to the kingdom. In addition to that, of course, we believe that engagement between entrepreneurs, whether from the region or internationally, with the local entrepreneurs is the only way to elevate the entrepreneurial kind of spirit, experience, quality of companies. We've also worked on easing the entrance of venture capital to the kingdom. The government has established government funds that match fund with private VCs or investors. And just to give you some numbers, the government funds that are dedicated to invest in startups in Saudi Arabia have around $1.7 billion. When you match fund that with private VCs, you reach around $3.5, $3.6 billion of investment. That the aim of that amount of capital is to be deployed in the Saudi market in the next 10 years. So we definitely made capital available. We've seen a lot of attention from foreign VCs or regional VCs to invest in Saudi. We try to ease also the setup and the entrance and access to market. And at the same time, within the Vision 2030, all of these limitless opportunities that unlocking new sectors, entertainment, culture, sports. So you can just imagine the number of opportunities of new sectors just opening up that haven't been even tapped into yet. So that's just kind of some of what the government has been working on, and still the government has been looking into how to offering more than just a demanding market. So we know that we have a very demanding market in the Gulf region and Saudi specifically, but you need to be competitive as well. So that's where enhancing regulations, trying to identify new opportunities, the ease of doing business, reducing the cost of doing business is also factors that the government or the governments in general are looking at the moment.
Great, thank you, Dr. Mazin. You mentioned VCs, so I do want to move over to Sonia now and ask, how have Gulf-based venture capital firms, funds, platforms adapted to this new economic environment, or at least the economic environment that has in some ways shifted in early 2020? And I guess the follow-on question to that is, would you be able to give us some insight into your estimation about some of those sectors, perhaps those firms in your portfolio that you believe have been positively impacted by some of the changes that we saw in early 2020?
Yeah, no problem. So in early 2020, our first reaction as VCs is to help our portfolio companies. So we tend to see a lot of the VCs at that time basically put a pause on investment. So as Philip was saying, a lot of the impact of the pause of a lot of these investors, and it was basically across the board at family offices, VCs put a pause just for a little bit, basically to understand first what's happening. So we focused on our portfolio companies at the time, try to help them navigate through the uncertain, or had to face drastic decisions at the time. Do they go into cash preservation mode? Do they start cutting staff? Do they change all expansion plans? Because at the time, you don't know when your next fundraise is going to happen. You got used to a very specific fundraising environment, which Philip went into it. The trends in the last 5 years has just been increasing, and the activity was starting to get predictable in terms of a startup knowing how much they can raise and where they can raise from, and the players were becoming very obvious, to a situation where it's very uncertain across the world. This every economy, every environment had to deal with this. So a lot of our portfolio companies, it came down to timing. So if you happen to be lucky to have signed and completed a fundraise in January 2020, the nature of the way a VC works is that your fundraising is very lumpy, and people tend to raise for 18 months runway per burn. So if you closed and raised money in the bank in January 2020, you can ride out the COVID situation quite easily, regardless of your business plan and what you plan to do. But other situations not so lucky. So a lot of it was timing, but then a lot of it comes down to which companies are actually pivoting and moving to the new norm. So you saw some companies coming online very quickly. You saw companies pivoting and servicing the new demand for deliveries, for groceries, for the sticky kind of behavior, the behavior that consumer behavior changed drastically within 1 week. People are changing the way they're operating online, the way they're functioning, and a lot of that behavior will remain. So the idea of everything moving online, digital, contactless, digital it will remain. So we have a few portfolio companies that really, I don't want to say benefited, but really were able to service the new norm very well. One of our portfolio companies called Clusive, which is based in the US, is basically a software that brings cafes and small mom and pop kind of shops online and give you like the Starbucks mobile ordering experience. And when Starbucks started their mobile ordering, their coffee sales went through the roof. So this is the same thing, but just for mom and pop shops. Because people can no longer come into the store and they're doing curbside pickups, their sales went through the roof because of the new norm. Another portfolio company that we invested in is called Onfido, which is a UK company, but used by a lot of the companies here in the Gulf. And they quickly, they are basically identity verification tool that's used by many companies, and they actually raised $100 million during COVID because their sales went up by 130% from the year before. So some companies were able to just deal with the new norm, and then we have and so they're able to pivot well. But and then we have other companies that were suffering because of the lockdown. One of the companies in India is the Zipcar of India, and if there's a complete lockdown, nobody's renting their cars. It's very specific to the sectors. It's very specific on how quickly they can adapt to the new norm, and very specific to their cash flows at the time.
Great, thank you so much, Sonia. I mean, all three of you speakers mentioned in your opening remarks, I mean, the uncertainty around financing. I think that's a really important point to dig into a little bit deeper. I might, I'll ask a question and maybe go to Philip and Mazin, and Sonia, feel free to jump in as well. But right now, the founders and the entrepreneurs who you are involved with and speaking with, where are they most optimistic about finding sources of funding? Where are they looking to? What are the ideal sources of financing? What are the fallbacks that they might have to resort to? And if the financing isn't available, what other options? What are some of the realistic options that they have? Philip, maybe we can turn it over to you first, and then over to Dr. Mazin.
So the predictability that Sonia was mentioning previously has kind of gone out the window right now, because up until this year, as I was mentioning, for instance, last year had 220 different institutions that had made investments in startups here in the region. And that's beyond the friends, family, fools, angels, community that invest at the very early stage. In fact, the reason that there's such a massive drop off in the number of deals is because accelerator programs that tend to be offline haven't really been operating until potentially now in the online space. And therefore that early stage deal flow supporting the beginning of the funnel is really being affected because those kind of programs aren't necessarily taking place. However, the trend differs by geography. I mean, definitely in Saudi Arabia, there is a huge amount of effort that's being put into place to support, whether it's through local initiatives, matching programs, even accelerator programs that are being done online. And actually, Saudi Arabia is seeing a record amount of investments, a number of investments that are taking place, spurred on predominantly by government initiatives that are really building the appetite of private investors. And thanks to the huge work that Dr. Mazin's doing and the work of SVC and Munshaat. In other kind of geographies, there remains government initiatives, predominantly in the fund of funds space. So instead of direct investments, they're supporting institutions that are already making investments. But there's also been hesitation and a slowdown in that type of activity. Ultimately, as Sonia was saying, in the same way as a startup's luck, shall we say, in terms of timing is based on when they receive the investment, the investors are in a very similar situation, because depending on where they are in deploying the funds of their actual fund, if they have recently fundraised from LPs, they will have a great opportunity to invest potentially at lower valuations of companies that they were already interested in, potentially companies that have seen accelerated growth that they hadn't been interested in before, now they're interested in. But if you are a fund that's looking to fundraise, the same challenges startups are facing, they're likely to be facing from LPs. And so that's currently the situation. Where do they traditionally go? I think a lot of people are starting to go online to try and identify investors. But the truth of the matter is, and I'll leave Sonia to give the advice from an investor's perspective, cash is king. If you can ultimately weather the storm as long as possible, demonstrating the strength of your business and your decision-making during this period, in the hope that a new norm begins to materialize, you're in a much stronger position than having to necessarily desperately find cash now to survive the current environment.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with a lot of what Philip's saying, especially in terms of the LP funding situation. Like when you think about it, LPs that have raised pre-2020 and are in deployment mode, there should be no change, and for them it's the opportunity to to take advantage of the new norm. The first thing that investors always ask a company is what's your COVID response? How are you responding to COVID? And a lot of that is now looking for, okay, the growth, we're not going to see the same numbers that we were seeing in the past, but are we going to see profitable growth? And we're looking deeper into the numbers. We're understanding how they can deal with this situation. Companies that can scale up and scale down become much more attractive, because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if the world is going to go back into lockdown, if flu season happens to be very horrible. It's just still uncertain times. So we're looking for companies that can adapt. But as Phil was saying, because it's cash is king, and so the LPs, the GPs that the funds that have raised earlier, they're now in a position they're going to deploy, but they're just going to be more picky about it, and they're going to be that they're going to take their time because they have time now.
Great, thank you, Sonia. And Dr. Mazin, I mean, on the government side, what's the outlook for the sources of financing coming from the government angle? We do know that this is a period where there are significant economic constraints across the region. Specifically, government budgets are really being pressed in a number of different places and in a number of different directions. So maybe you could give us an idea about how Saudi policymakers are taking this into account, but also ensuring that that funding support and financial support is still in place.
Yeah. Yes, Robert. So the government has, most of the governments, whether in Saudi or the region, or especially GCC countries, they've announced some stimulus packages to support startups during the pandemic or the lockdown. Currently now the government has a huge focus on even the sustainability of these startups, where the government has a lot of initiatives of developing an SME bank, different financing tools or products with the private sector. There's a lot of work that SAMA, the central bank, with the Capital Market Authority in Saudi, they've developed these sandboxes. They've encouraged fintech companies to come up with new solutions, especially in financing SMEs and startups when it comes to work capital, investment, etc. So there's a lot happening from that side. But if I may, just to take it from another angle, talking about the startups or entrepreneurs, how do they were able now, or even during the pandemic, to raise investment. I think that's where it's different a bit for Saudi, because what we've seen is actually increase in the amount of deals that happened during the COVID-19. We've seen these technology companies, these startups, which I believe were our champions during the lockdown, where they were able to scale very quickly, whether in edtech, in delivery, and healthcare, and they were able to meet the needs of what's the needs of the community at that point of time, with the support, of course, of the government trying to ease all of that up. I believe that what happened, although how we look at the COVID-19 lockdown and the negative impact that it has created, actually it has increased the appetite, especially at angel investors at Saudi. So last year we had only maybe one angel group. Now we have like 4 or 5 angel groups in Saudi. There's a huge interest in technology companies changing the game. I mean, everybody has the amount of adoption that happened during the COVID-19 by people, whether shopping online, telehealthcare, education, etc., has changed, as mentioned by my colleagues, the behavior of the consumers, which also people started locally believing into, and I'm talking about angel investors, believing that these things really work, these add real value. It's getting more interest from the public, from the government. So I believe that with everything that's happening, that more interest in investing, especially when it comes to the large market that we have in Saudi and also in the region, the possibility of scaling up, reaching that unicorn, let's say, valuation, is a high potential in the region. And I think we should look at it from a different kind of angle, where I think this is more of an opportunity that we believe entrepreneurs and investors could take a big role in and make it and make history after that or from it.
Thank you, Dr. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sonia. Please jump in.
To Dr. Mazin, I believe, I absolutely agree with everything you just said, and especially Saudi's reaction to COVID-19 and a lot of these initiatives that Dr. Mazin has just mentioned has caused even us at VentureSoup, we now have a major focus on fintech specifically, and it is because of the sandboxes that are coming out of Saudi, the regulators making it easier for fintechs to operate. It's the funding that is available to these startups that have made this sector super interesting for us, and especially now with fintech that has just accelerated this significantly, and it is because of the governments really taking really saying, you know what, we want another unicorn to come out of Saudi, UAE, etc., and the governments are really working hard to take us there.
Both Sonia, both you and Dr. Mazin, I mean, you mentioned the interest on the side of investors, that perhaps many of the developments that happened in early 2020 have actually created a lot of investment opportunities. Philip mentioned this as well. But if we shift the angle to the actual founders and entrepreneurs themselves, I know that becoming an entrepreneur, becoming a founder of a startup was actually is a popular and trendy career path for many local citizens across the region. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Mazin. What is your perception? I know that this is still early days, but are the opportunities of these massive changes outweighing the potential economic challenges that startups and entrepreneurs are facing? Are we still seeing interest by local Saudi citizens in becoming entrepreneurs in what might be a very lucrative career path, but also will have certainly its fair share of challenges over the coming months and years?
So I always say that Saudis is kind of a bit different than any other country based on different factors. And this is one of it, is that there's so much huge opportunities in the kingdom. You can imagine that you had a closed box and you just opened it up recently, where there's all of these different sectors, all of these different opportunities, huge digitization required, giga projects happening, building cities. So if you look at every corner around that and every element, you find that lies a lot of opportunities. The thing is that Saudis have it's become more popular for a graduate or even bankers or even government employees to just start their own company and leave the government or leave the private sector, or fresh graduate from school. And this wasn't the norm 2-3 years ago. I think it's based on that we've seen success stories such as Kareem. We've seen some of the national kind of, let's say, startups that are growing very well in Saudi, whether Noon Academy, for example, which is an edtech that has been expanding in India, Egypt, Pakistan, around the region, that served the community a lot during the lockdown. Marsul, the delivery company that also growing hugely in Saudi and now expanding in the region. So when they see all of that, when they notice that, and this is, even for us, wasn't something we could imagine that we would have a unicorn in the region. So Kareem actually broke that let's say, that, or enabled that, actually made that belief a reality, that it could happen. And this is one of the things, is that why we've noticed now that a lot of VCs, especially from the US and China, have been targeting or kind of allocating some of their investments in Saudi in the region, is that it makes a lot of sense that some unicorns are going to show up in the region, just like what happened in China and others. And based on the growth that's happening in the region, especially in Saudi, and a lot of other factors, they believe in the entrepreneurs in the region. We believe in them. I believe in the entrepreneurs in Saudi. I believe in the entrepreneurs in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Jordan, and all of them. And even although I know that when you look, when investors look at it, look at the region from the outside, they think it's fragmented market. There's different separate countries, etc. But actually, the ecosystem is connected. So you would find a startup in Egypt that's doing business in Saudi, expanding to Jordan, one in Dubai, setting up in Saudi, expanding in Egypt. So I think that's what's happening. And this is encouraging a lot of entrepreneurs, not only in Saudi, but in the region to kind of take this route of innovation and entrepreneurship and start their own companies. And I believe at the end, it's the opportunity, and we have the human capital. And I always say, if a VC or investor wants to come from outside the region and he wants to invest in the region, he wants to invest in local companies and local talent. They know the market, they understand it. And the number of deals that have been happening in the last couple of years have actually shown huge growth and increase. And this actually encourages everyone to take this opportunity of investment, setting up new companies, etc. In Saudi and the region.
Great, thank you so much. Go ahead, Sonia, please.
I agree. The quality of founders in the last 5 years has become even more impressive than we've seen in the past. So we see a lot of founders that are now, graduating from schools in the States, top tech schools, start maybe doing a year or two over in San Francisco, and then coming back here, realizing the potential of this market and starting to service the country that they're from, and having pride in building companies here, as opposed to either working for a tech company in San Francisco or coming back and working for a corporate or a government in Saudi. There's now become a pride of building something for the region and seeing that innovation grow, which we think is very impressive.
There are a couple of questions from the audience on social engagement and also the role that women are playing in the startup environment. I'm going to get back to this. I think it's an important topic. The last question I have, I do want to ask one more question for Philip before we move to audience questions. And I want to expand the scope a little bit of our conversation, or at least the geographic scope, beyond just the Gulf, and talk about some of the other emerging markets in Africa, in South Asia, for example, that are an important part of what's going on in the Gulf, and it's important to discuss those as well. So, I mean, how are we seeing the economic climate in other emerging markets across the globe having an impact on what's going on in the Gulf's startup ecosystem?
Thank you for that. I mean, look, I think it's very interesting. The Gulf, and especially the GCC, likes to position it in the middle of between East and West. And I think what we have seen as Magnet, hence our expansion beyond MENA into what we're calling the emerging venture markets, which will include Southeast Asia and Africa, is that you're seeing almost the Silk Road effect begin to play out also in the tech space. You have a lot of Southeast Asian investors and founders exploring how to begin to enter the Middle East. You also have African, i.e. sub-Saharan, looking to go up north. Already North Africa is part of the Middle East kind of remit when they're looking for investment and growth, especially from Egypt and Morocco. But I think what's becoming more interesting is that international investors, in the pursuit of good opportunities, realize that valuations are still relatively low in the Middle East because of the disconnect between the demand and supply of capital. And there's two things that they often see is, number one, are there companies that do similar things or have similar attributes to their portfolio companies that already exist in other markets, that they can potentially leverage the experience that they've had in the US, Europe, potentially Southeast Asia or China, that they would like to invest in. And that's one thing that we're beginning to see happen more often. And the second is potentially fueling their own portfolio companies to acquire. So you're beginning to see an increase in mergers and acquisitions that are happening here in the region, either from international players looking to acquire market share, because there are still challenges with the market being fragmented, which is predominantly the high barrier to entry as to why local entrepreneurs are able to succeed by localizing products and differentiating it to international counterparts. But then they become very interesting and ripe for acquisition from international players, as well as many players in specific industries, whether it's e-commerce, transport, fintech, or across the board, that do similar things across the region that when combined become a much stronger force. But when we look across the emerging venture space, I still believe, and that's part of our mandate, breaking down the barriers of knowledge, transparency, and information will further see cross-pollination of opportunities, especially when it comes to talent. I still believe, and I'll just caveat what Dr. Mazin said, and Sonia to a certain extent, I believe that entrepreneurship is still over-glamorized here in the region. And too many people believe that in the pursuit of the unicorn, that it is very easy to do. It is not, and it is very challenging. But as you begin to see the success stories happen, what you are beginning to see is not only the graduates going to international universities and coming back, but the graduates of successfully exited companies starting future companies. And I think that is extremely healthy, because people who have the know-how and the experience, or serial entrepreneurs or people with experience in the venture startup space, creating those companies is extremely important. But the real backbone of successful companies are the talent, and the more talent that can be acquired from regional countries and emerging startup ecosystems will be the strength of the MENA ecosystem as it continues to grow.
Thank you, Philip. I'm going to now shift over to some audience questions. And I think the first one I'm going to direct toward Dr. Mazin. I might also ask the speakers here to, as much as possible, try to keep them short. I'll do my part by trying to keep the questions concise, but we have a few questions I'd like to get through, and time is running away from us. So a pretty straightforward question for you, Dr. Mazin. What role does the Saudi Public Investment Fund play in the startup ecosystem in Saudi Arabia? I know that this is definitely a question that has stirred a certain amount of debate in terms of how much of the PIF's investments are directed domestically, how much of them are directed internationally, and there are various views on that. But what's the role of the PIF in the startup ecosystem? If you could give us an idea of that with some brief comments, that would be appreciated.
Sure. So within the plans of the PIF, they have the plan. I think it ends by 2020. Now they're going to develop a new plan to 2025. You can access it online, and it shows that they're focusing on 9 sectors to develop within the kingdom. One of them is the SME startup sector. They've established a fund called Jeddah. They've allocated $1 billion to invest into funds, where they would be investing into startups. And that's one of, let's say, the initiatives that they're doing. They're doing a lot of other initiatives across different investments that they're doing in the kingdom. Although from outside the kingdom, a lot would assume that most of the investments are happening outside Saudi. There's a lot of huge investments happening in Saudi through the Giga project and through their portfolio companies in the kingdom.
Great, thank you very much. I might now ask both Sonia and Philip to answer this question. So we have a question: is how well represented are women in the startup environment in the Gulf? And maybe you can comment about the role of women, whether in terms of founders or entrepreneurs, or on the financing investment side, and also other interesting demographic insights that you think are worth bringing to bear. So Sonia, maybe you'd like to start?
Sure. It is a small community of women in startups and investing and as entrepreneurs. But we as investors have some phenomenal female entrepreneurs in our portfolio companies, and they're some of the best. So we don't discriminate against it, but it is a small community, and I'm sure Philip will know the data off the top of his head and how it compares to other markets as well. But I wouldn't expect it to be too far off other markets, or even like San Francisco or the other developed markets like India. So it is small, but there are quite a few initiatives that are happening to bring the women together, to encourage women to become investors, to encourage women to become entrepreneurs. When you think about a female's actual, like if we think about our lifestyles, females, we have kids, etc. Entrepreneurship actually is, it's been amazing for me as a mom, because I actually became an entrepreneur through my fund, like where I stopped working at the Investment Council right when I became a mom, and it's been phenomenal because I work a lot, but it's much more flexible, so I can pick him up from school, but then I work until midnight. but you can make it work, and the females are talking to each other, and they're making sure that we're supportive of each other. We Venture Street are working on initiatives to help bring out females. We started a conscious investor fellowship with KAUST, NYU AD, and Start AD, which is an invite-only fellowship where to bring mission-driven investors together. And of those, the invite-only, it will be 50% female invited to it. So there's ways in which we're trying to do our part to bring out the females and the investors and encourage them to participate.
Yeah, I mean, so off the top of my head, I was actually trying to look for some numbers. So there is female representation. There is a strong female community of founders. I was just looking at the numbers now. If you look at female founders only, or female founders in mixed founded companies, they represent about 10% of all funding in the region. So clearly there's still a huge room for improvement in trying to develop that. If you actually look at it in terms of the number of female founders, it is not actually, surprisingly, I believe that the percentage is about 18% of founders are female in the region, which is not off the averages of the US and Europe, which are at 15 or 14%, if not a little bit higher here. But that doesn't mean that there isn't continued room for growth. And I know that there has been a concerted effort to make sure that there is strong female representations, whether it's on panels and conferences and speakers and institutions that empower female entrepreneurship in the region. So I guess the positive is that it's acknowledged and it's an area of focus, but there's definitely continued room for improvement in that space.
Thank you, Philip. Great. I'm going to now have a number of questions just popping up. So I'm going to read 3 questions, first for Dr. Mazin, one for Sonia, and then one for Philip. So I'll get the questions out of the way and then let all 3 of you have at them, and feel free to jump in on other questions to piggyback if you'd like on the response. The first one for Dr. Mazin is saying, with your background in cybersecurity, how far have you seen cybersecurity startups emerge in Saudi Arabia and the GCC market, or do customers still look internationally? So that's for Dr. Mazin. I'll just continue on into Sonia. We also had a question about Gulf startups benefiting from local content requirements and in-country value programs put on by the likes of national oil companies or other state-run industries. Are they doing this? And if so, is it because, if they're not part of these programs, is it because they're not designed with startups in mind? Or is it because startups do not meet the needs of local content programs and that those needs are seeking to fill? So it's a little complicated question, but you work with a number of different parties involved in the financing, so maybe you'll be able to shed light on that. Finally, to Philip, another recent development, we'll put you on the spot here. Your opinion of the potential for the UAE, Bahrain, Israel cooperation in tech, and the other speakers can also jump in if they would like. So those are 3 questions, and maybe we'll have Dr. Mazin start us off on cybersecurity.
Sure. I believe there's huge opportunities for cybersecurity in Saudi and the region. There isn't a good number of startups in cybersecurity within, I think, the GCC arena. However, based that the government has been putting new procedures, guidelines, compliance, etc., to manage cybersecurity, I think this opens a lot of opportunities for cybersecurity startups to kind of see some of these opportunities. So definitely it's one of the technology areas that I think would have a high potential of success in the region.
Thank you. Over to Sonia for local content requirements and in-country value programs. It's, I think, a tricky one, but if anyone can answer it, I think it would be you.
Yeah, I think the programs that the startups are benefiting most are the ones that Dr. Mazin had mentioned earlier. PIF's involvement with JDA Fund of Funds, and that trickle down from managers to the local the local companies, because then there's sometimes requirements or emphasis on investing within Saudi and encouraging that. So I think there are specific startup programs run by the state that are extremely helpful for the startups, and they've been built to cater them specifically. So broader programs by the national oil companies, we haven't really seen the impact, but it's these initiatives that Dr. Mazin had mentioned before have been creating a huge impact on the startups and building that ecosystem within the countries, the various countries, UAE and Saudi.
Great, thank you, Philip. Over on the prospects for UAE, Israel, Bahrain, some of the normalization agreements that are going on, and how that might trickle over to tech cooperation and investment.
Look, I think everything has been quite fresh. The announcement was only made, the official signing was last week, and all the announcement was in the last couple of weeks. I fortunately, through Magnet, have conversations with ministers and people from across the UAE, and they're very excited to see how they can build a collaboration between the region and Israel. The truth of the matter is we don't know how that is going to kind of develop in terms of tangible initiatives yet. I guess the two obvious things that come to mind is capital remains key for the region, and that there'll be a demand for capital from all sources and any geography. And if that's a benefit to startups in the region, that's one area that will likely be explored. And the other is, as companies look to scale and expand by geography, that becomes a market that could be interesting from both sides. And I'm sure that there's lots of learning lessons that the region can learn from the Israeli ecosystem. But currently, I was listening to an interview yesterday, it's a great opportunity to begin conversations, but I don't know what tangibly comes out in terms of opportunities and initiatives yet, but I'm sure that they will be articulated in the coming months.
All right, thank you, Philip. I'll move on to the question of protecting intellectual property. So we had one question, what structures or policies are in place in the region to protect intellectual property? Maybe I will address, I will let Dr. Mazin and Sonia address that, both Dr. Mazin from a government side, but Sonia in her advisory role with a number of startups and entrepreneurs. Where can these founders and entrepreneurs look to ensure that their ventures are protected and that their intellectual property is protected?
Sure. So within Saudi and the GCC countries, every country has an authority that's looking at IP protection, offering the different services, and for them to file for patents, trademarks, etc. And also there's a joint, if I can correctly, if it's a council or some kind of, let's say, joint initiative between the GCC countries on the IP protection as well. So if you're just in one country, you can definitely have your patent or your IP registered in other countries as well. And we give a lot of high attention to IP in general, and we know that it's a very important component of innovation and startups.
Yeah, I think that's answered quite well. That we do look to see that patents are filed and everything is in order with respect to intellectual property. A lot of times we see sometimes that sits in structures outside of the local entities. They might have holding companies outside where some of those laws are much more clear. But it's something that is something that everyone always is concerned about.
Okay. Thank you. Leading to one of the last questions, we're running out of time, but I'll do two more questions. The first is on social entrepreneurship, and I think I'll let Philip answer this one because his work at Magnet and through the reports has a good bird's eye view of the scene. Philip, I mean, what's been achieved in the Gulf in this area, and what more should be done to encourage social entrepreneurs?
Look, it's a great question. I don't have the data offhand. I think that like people have to, there needs to be an appreciation that the whole venture space and the ecosystem is still at a very nascent stage, and social entrepreneurship is a very specific segment of that ecosystem. While I know that there are certain institutions in Abu Dhabi and across the region that are focused on social entrepreneurship, it is still building the investor appetite, both at an angel level and an institutional level, to invest in VC as an asset class. So is there room for further growth and improvement? I'm sure. Have there been startups in the social space that have necessarily grown to a significant level? Probably not to date. I'm sure there are examples, and Sonia can correct me if I'm wrong. But as a subsection of venture as an asset class, I still think that there's a huge way for it to go, but so can the whole of the asset class itself, and naturally it'll grow with it.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, I'm going to move away from the audience questions just a little bit. We've covered most of them. One or two actually talked about the broader social dynamics. And during the conversation today, Dr. Mazin brought up local startups and local founders and entrepreneurs, and Sonia and Philip have talked about that as well. Philip has been in the region for a number of years, but I guess in many cases would be considered an expat founder himself. So my last question as a way of wrapping up is, how do governments in the region strike the right balance between providing support and funding and financing for local founders and local entrepreneurs on the one hand, but also expatriate residents who in many cases have moved to the region to start new ventures and set up new firms? So how do you strike the right balance at a time when we're seeing increasing workforce nationalization requirements, local labor requirements across the region? I think this is a tricky balance to strike, and be curious to get your three thoughts on that as part of some concluding remarks.
So yeah, I'll jump in before Dr. Mazin. I'll take the complete extreme of free markets, in the view that if you want to have a healthy ecosystem, as I mentioned earlier, talent is the core of that. And it shouldn't be constrained by geography or by where you're from. And it should ultimately be survival of the fittest. And ultimately, you create competition that can healthily grow different startups, and we learn from each other. Even if big companies from abroad, you have Deliveroo that has come from the UK to the UAE and grown into becoming a massive company, but we give the same examples of the people that have left Kareem and created their own companies. The learning that they had in that organization, whether local or expatriates, have benefited from that rather than kind of restricting it. But the same doesn't necessarily apply across the whole of the region. UAE is particular, given the size of the market and the size of the population and the number of expats. If you go to Egypt, Lebanon, or Jordan, you are very unlikely to find any expats. So it's a completely local dominated founder and talent community. But I'd love to hear from Dr. Mazin how you can try and solve for that. But my view is that allow for free mobility of talent, especially from abroad, to encourage and foster the ecosystem as opposed to trying to restrict it.
So I think for founders especially, what we've been doing in the kingdom is that we're offering them the same opportunity as local founders. So if a founder obtains a license, he pays the same fees, he can open his office, open a bank account, the same Saudiization, or for local or even a foreign company. When he obtains the commercial registration as a Saudi entity in Saudi, he's treated 100% like any other local firm. And I think that's very important, because even when it comes to raising more investments, etc., it goes back to the company, the potential of the startup, the ability to attract venture capital investment, etc. But at the base, at the baseline of setting up a company, they have, when they obtain the license, which is the entrepreneurship license, is $500 a year, which is, I think, in reach of all startups or entrepreneurs, and they can set up the company. They can operate like any local entity in the region, still attracting talent is a challenge, not just for us, for most countries around the world. The government has been developing a lot of initiatives and different kind of projects to be able to attract talent in different ways. And I believe in the next couple of years, hopefully we'll reach that point that Saudi will be a very attractive location for talent, not only investment, but talent in the region.
I agree with both the gentlemen here on their sentiment with respect to this question. If you look at the JADA program in Saudi, it's not just funding as local Saudi GPs. It's funding all sorts of GPs, knowing that the funding that goes through those VCs will make it down to Saudi companies and encourage that. But if you have talent coming from external abroad and international countries that can bring in know-how that would help build that ecosystem, it's just beneficial for everybody, and that's what's happening.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all of you, Sonia, Philip, and Dr. Mazin. We've unfortunately run out of time. I think there's a lot more that we could discuss today, but we'll save that for later conversations. Thank you to everyone who joined us remotely and may watch this in the future. You can find a number of events, past events, and publications on our website at agsiw.org. And we look forward to welcoming you to a future event in the coming weeks and months. So stay safe and be well. And thanks again for the speakers who joined us today and lent us their time and their insights.